What's good, you guys? C.A.S.T back with another video. Now, I'm sure if you're in the hardware space, you've heard about the latest Intel CPU release. You've heard about the 9800X3D probably going to be announced in the next week or so as far as the actual official specs, and we are all looking forward to the next series of graphics cards from NVIDIA and AMD. A lot of people have been posting videos specifically talking about whether it's time for you to upgrade or not, and what you should be looking for when upgrading your PC. I just want to give you guys a little bit more perspective. Jay's 2 cents, he posted a video about a week ago from the time of me filming this, and I kind of wanted, he made some good points, but also some not so good points I personally disagree with. I think that just kind of goes down to the mindset difference that I have versus, I guess, other people in the space have. My mindset is like, if it's not broke, don't fix it, and always look to optimize what you already have. So with that being said, we're going to just do a breakdown of the different parts of Jay's video, give my reaction, my personal opinion on it, and yeah, hopefully it'll be informational for you guys. Now, this is coming from someone that is a hardware enthusiast, but is always looking for a good deal, likes messing around with older hardware and newer hardware, a mix of everything. And I think I go about building my PC as far as like what I rank as far as most important, least important, different from the average consumer. But I think it's the most healthy mindset to have when you actually want to like focus on like getting the best price for performance and satisfaction of your PC build. So yeah, let's go ahead and get in this video, guys. All right, guys, as always, gotta give credit to the original poster. So link in the description to the original video if you guys are curious about checking that out. But yeah, what to watch, or watch this before you consider upgrading your PC. Let's get into this.
So this is not your typical like things to know before you upgrade. No, it's actual real data to kind of look at to give you guys some ideas on when it's time to upgrade. I'm getting a lot of these comments. This happens anytime there's a new family of GPU or CPU or platform coming out. Obviously, Core Ultra, Arrow Lake stuff has been announced. We know the new chipset, new memory optimizations, obviously 9000 series AMD CPUs. We got 50 series coming up, mid-range stuff coming up from AMD for GPUs. So we're going to talk about each component right now and how to determine when it's time for that component to be upgraded, because all of them pretty much operate independently of each other.
All right, so first off, before we get into the meat and potatoes, my personal take on it, whenever you're building a PC, I think you should always build it to make sure that your needs are met for the next at least 4 years, in my personal opinion. So the idea of getting like the budget gaming PC, it really comes down to like how much you're willing to compromise. And if it gets down to the point to where you're buying like bargain bin parts, you're probably going to spend more money in the long run rather than just buying like a pre-built PC that someone is selling on Facebook Marketplace, or doing like a Dell Optiplex upgrade. I think if you're looking to really save money and get into PC gaming for cheap, like cheap, getting some sort of like office PC and then throwing a graphics card in is probably going to be your best bet, because you're still going to do an upgrade like eventually for that platform. Building an entry-level PC, in my personal opinion, really does not make that much sense. You're buying like a cheap case, you're buying a cheap power supply, just like the bare minimum to scratch by and play video games. You're going to want to upgrade that eventually, especially if you get hooked on it. So it's just better to have like, something that's relatively inexpensive. That way you know what you want to get into, rather than spending more money, still cheap, but like more money on a system that is like dead-end hardware where literally everything needs to be upgraded. You throw in like a budget system for like $600, you want to get a new graphics card, new power supply automatically. You're probably going to want to, eventually get into a motherboard with way more features available to you, more USBs. You want to, more PCIe, accessories as far as, what the motherboard's actually capable of doing. More BIOS settings to be able to overclock if you want to go down that route. You try to get a new cooler, like a AIO or something like that. Your case isn't good. Like, eventually you might get to the point to where you have to upgrade so much that you would have been better off just buying more money, like spending more money up front, getting like a mid-range system, low mid, or like mid-high range system. That way you can like grow into the platform. If you're not willing to do that, I personally think like, honestly, just get like a laptop and see if that can suffice your needs. Look at like used market for like pre-built or old gaming PCs, secondhand like full systems, or like do the Optiplex home office PC upgrade with graphics card. This is my personal opinion.
Let's start with the CPU, literally the brain of your system. So this is going to hold true for whether or not you're on AMD or Intel. So I'm not going to specifically say if you're on this CPU, it's time, because there's a bajillion different use cases out there that would determine whether or not it's time to upgrade. For instance, if you had something like a 5950X, and all you're doing is like light gaming and maybe consuming content, maybe doing some live streaming, you're probably still pretty set for a while. My usual response to whether or not it's time to upgrade a CPU is, does it do what you want it to do as fast as you want it to do it? But you might be asking yourself, how do I know it's doing it faster or slower than I need it to? Well, there's actually quite a bit of tools out there that you can use to help you determine whether or not it's up to the task or starting to become near the limits of its capabilities. So one of the first tools...
All right, so this is where I personally have my first disagreement. And I think, a lot of people put the CPU on like a hierarchy, the brain of the system. My personal opinion, while that is true, like, instead of it being like kind of like the mastermind, the commander-in-chief of your PC, I think of more of it like the conductor for like an orchestra, for example. Now, the conductor for an orchestra is like really important, but like not to the same level of importance as a chief of like a general army. Well, maybe that's not the best comparison. I guess people who are like music fans can like make that determination for themselves. But from my standpoint, like, if you don't have the talent around you, per se, as far as like, people being able to play their instruments properly, then the conductors really can't, benefit that. I think the CPU is honestly nowadays not as important in the overall PC build in comparison to what it was in prior years. And that's just goes down to like software and hardware optimization, specifically like around the ecosystem. And eventually, we're going to get into the topic of bottlenecks. You don't need like any sort of like hardware monitoring or software to be able to determine whether or not your CPU is good or not. You can just feel whether or not your CPU is adequate for your needs or not. And of all the bottlenecks that you want to have in your system, a CPU bottleneck is probably the safest and the bottleneck you want to go for if you're going to have a bottleneck. Well, not if, because pretty much every single system is going to have a weakest link. Every single system is going to have a bottleneck. To the extent of which is bottlenecked is determined by the hardware you choose. So instead of like, in my personal opinion, instead of focusing on like the delta between the potential of your system and like how much is kneecapping, the CPU is kneecapping your overall performance, you should be looking at the overall experience that you're getting with that kneecap performance of the CPU and see if that's adequate or not. I could care less if my CPU is running at 100% all the time, if it's running at 5% all the time, 50%, wherever in between. If the actual experience for what I'm doing is not sufficient, then it's time to upgrade. And the way the hardware and software is going, the CPU is taking a less and less of important role, especially in gaming PCs. That's why I have my FX 9590, a 12, 15-year-old CPU at this point, still going strong and not showing any signs of wear and tear. Now, obviously, it's not the fastest. I have a pair with 3080, but I'm able to play pretty much all the games I want to play at 4K. No problem whatsoever. Now, am I handicapping my 3080 to the point at which it's not even faster than like a 3060 Ti? Yes, but that gaming experience I'm getting on that system is good enough. It's actually really good. In fact, like, I would argue that it might even make sense for me to upgrade to the next generation of GPU, because I'm going to be able to take advantage of things like DLSS or frame generation or all these other technologies that come with the newer hardware with graphics cards that make the overall gaming experience good, even though you have a CPU bottleneck. And explain the other bottlenecks, like a GPU bottleneck. If you're like really like pegged on GPU performance, where you're just like nothing's working, you're gonna have a stuttering mess. I like to think that with CPUs, assume your CPU is functioning properly and the game's optimized well to work, you're just going to cap your max, FPS. You might have some spikes and 1% lows, but for the most part, you can play around that. You can adjust to it. It won't be that big of a deal. Having not enough RAM, you're going to have significant slowdowns in your system. Not enough GPU horsepower. The whole game is just not going to run properly. You're going to have to drop the entire resolution. With a CPU bottleneck, if you want to ease up the load in the CPU to actually turn up the graphic settings to kind of even out that discrepancy between the potential FPS you could get with your GPU versus what you're actually getting. Not having a fast enough SSD or hard drive, that can really kneecap a system, or having too much of your hard drive like filled up as far as like space, not enough free space where it can't function properly. That's really going to handicap your overall performance of your system more so than a CPU is. So that's just my personal opinion. CPUs are important, but only to the extent at which it makes sense. I think, personally, the motherboard takes way more priority, and he'll get to that eventually. I mean, there's a reason why like the Optiplex Office PC builds are a thing. There's a reason why $150 PC builds are a thing for gaming performance. And there's a reason why when people suggest budget PC builds for like $700, they put the majority of that money into the graphics card and put like a anemic CPU. That's a CPU bottleneck, but in the standpoint for gaming purposes, it makes the most sense. Now, once you get into like video editing and other kind of workloads, the CPU takes more of a priority. For example, like I would not edit videos on FX 9590 because it just doesn't have enough CPU horsepower to allow me to scrub through the timeline effectively. But for gaming and just normal use cases, a CPU really isn't going to handicap you that much.
I would highly recommend that you download to look at is Hardware Info 64. It's a great utility that just displays every single system sensor that's available and visible, all the way down to like the smart status of your hard drives. Everything is visible on there. So if you want to ask yourself, like, is my CPU starting to hold back my GPU? Because usually the biggest concern with CPUs, especially when we're talking about gamers, is my CPU bottlenecking my GPU? But sometimes you might be surprised to find out that a bottleneck exists somewhere else that you didn't even consider. So if you were to load up, say, Hardware Info 64, or even something like MSI Afterburner and see the CPU use percentage on there, you can start to determine whether or not your CPU is starting to hold back. Games that use a lot more CPU that you may not realize, Minecraft. Minecraft uses way more CPU than GPU. The only time GPU really starts to get utilized at all is doing things like shader packs and texture packs and all that. Then that gets done in post-processing.
Mind you, I get over 100 FPS at 4K in Minecraft with my 9590. Just to keep things in perspective, yes, he is correct, but
it gets processed onto the chunks that the CPU is responsible for. Games like Cyberpunk actually have a lot of CPU-bound type of functionality. Flight Sim has a lot of CPU-bound type of functionality built into it.
Now, don't have experience with those two games, but I would be very, very scared to play those games on my FX 9590. So he has a point, but I bring up the FX 9590 because, like, I literally think that I might be one of the few people that actually not only, like, uses it on a regular basis, but actually posts content on YouTube using that. So, like, you have anything from 2018 or newer, you are literally getting, like, double the CPU horsepower performance that I am. So I don't have experience with these games specifically, right? But even if you had like a 2700X, for example, 3600, old school AM4, Ryzen 3000 or 2000 CPUs that are like chump change now, or 9900K, even like 4790K possibly. That was a decent overhead over the FX 9590. Like, you probably could still play these games at pretty decent settings, possibly even 4K, with proper graphics cards like DLSS upscaling and frame generation. But like, there's a reason to get on that, that software access through that hardware, because it can really revitalize old hardware. So probably couldn't play those games on my CPU, but I have literally like one of the worst CPUs known to PC enthusiasts. So there's that.
So what you need to do is load up one of these utilities, go into your game, be monitoring it, and keep an eye on your CPU utility. If your CPU is starting to look like it's up in the 80s, high 70s, low 80s, it might be time to consider that your CPU might be starting to reach its limitations on what's being asked of it. Now, what's being asked of it is going to be determined on the software that you're using. So we're talking gaming at this point. Obviously, when it comes to things like video editing or encoding or 3D rendering, most of that's done on GPU, but a lot of people still use CPU for that. So we're not going to talk about the professional side of it or compiling for like code. We're going to talk about gaming side.
So I think it was interesting you showed in that clip. First off, I don't personally like using hardware info. I have it installed on some of my PCs, but I've seen across the board. I have only experience with AMD platforms, but hardware info 64 utilizes quite a bit of resources, and I see a noticeable difference in like performance when it's running in the background versus when it's not. I personally like using CPU ID hardware info. That's what I primarily use in the background whenever I'm running stress tests or benchmarking, and then actually when I'm running games, I actually use Argus Monitor. Now, I did pay for a license for that. I think it's like anywhere from $10 to $20 for like a full license, so it is worth it. But that's just a monitoring software. I use that for controlling my fans, and I also use that. It tells you very basic like CPU utilization, CPU temperature, all the good stuff. You don't need every single sensor in your system unless you're like literally trying to maximize performance. Like hardware info was good for me because it prevented me from needing to install Asus AI Suite on my FX based system, which told me like VRM temperatures, the Northbridge temperature, so on and so forth. That wasn't showing up in like Artist Monitor or CPU ID hardware info, or hardware monitor, excuse me. But like running it in during games, I personally really like it. I've gotten off MSI Afterburner. I use GPU Tweak 3. I find that to be a more up to date, simpler, more consistent. Like it actually applies my settings when I turn on my system. So I like GPU Tweak 3. Other people have their preferences, but that's just me. The FPS you saw was like around the 90s and dropped to the 60s. My personal opinion, like that's still okay, especially in a game like Cyberpunk. You're not going to be twitching around your mouse that fast in a game like that to where you need to render all that stuff really quickly. Cyberpunk is not a twitch shooter type of game. You can have fast-paced moments, but not to the point where you're shaking your mouse around like that. I don't think that's really a realistic expectation. Now, it's not like you don't want to see a dip in 30 FPS, but you're still above 60, so there is that. At that point, in that specific scenario, it really depends on the refresh rate of your monitor. I think that would be way more noticeable in like a 120 hertz monitor versus like a 60 hertz monitor. So just something to keep in mind.
Now, what you need to do is not just look at the CPU util as a whole and say, what is my usage look like? Because you might look at it as a whole and say, oh, I'm only at 22%. But then you look at it on a per thread basis and you realize a couple of your cores are just pegged at 100%. Now, that doesn't mean that your CPU has something wrong. It doesn't mean that the affinity or the way that the program is leveraging the CPU is wrong. It just might mean that that game only has 1 or 2 world threads. That's the actual thread running the game, happening on 1 or 2 cores, and then the other cores just sort of bounce around or are available to the system as needed.
Also, a very good point. Actually, let him finish his point.
Modern games are starting to become multi-threaded. And it's funny that we're still having this conversation in 2024 because we started this back in like 2006 when we talked about games and multi-threading. We're starting to see more and more games become highly multi-threaded where they can start to use other cores and affinity available to handle subtasks within the game. So whether it be like NPC control or any sort of AI function in the game that's happening in real time, they can start to leverage other CPU cores for that.
And that's one of the major reasons why I think CPU like utilization or CPU upgrades are not as important nowadays for that specific reason alone. I have like first-hand experience because I've been playing, if you play free-to-play games like me or any sort of like, if you're really like into like one specific game, you will notice how performance changes from update to update. So my go-to probably most time I put into a game, like FPS game, is Warface. I remember, playing Warface back when I built my first PC. I was lucky to get over like 90 FPS on my 8350 back in the day, and I would regularly do like reinstalls of the game on my hard drive. I had it running on a WD Black spinning hard drive to be able to like, I guess, make sure all the files were in like the same place in the partition on the drive, and I would see a noticeable increase in performance. If there's like a major update, I would just reinstall the entire game, not just do the patch updates because that would like kind of slow down performance. So yeah, but it's kind of things you would notice like happening like that. There's ways around that, like faster SSDs really make a huge difference, and where that isn't necessarily needed on like older systems. But like back in the day in 2013, 2014, this game was only maybe running on 2 threads at most, and that's why I was seeing such a low FPS. And this was at 1080p. If I play that same game at 1080p, even on the same graphics card, but even like a newer graphics card that's technically still bottlenecked to perform like an older graphics card, I went from 90 FPS in 2013 to like over 200 FPS on average in 2021 over the course of like 7-8 years with this game optimizing how it's handling the cores on the same CPU over the course of 8 years, more than doubled the actual FPS. In some cases, even triple the FPS. Like in certain maps, I would be able to get like approach sniff on 300 FPS. And that's just what happens when games are able to utilize more of the cores. And since we've had hyper-threading, we've had multi-core CPUs for quite a long time. Quad-core, 4-core, 8-thread CPUs going back to the 8350, which is 8-core, 8-thread, depending on who you want to discuss that with. Games are performing better for that one reason, which makes, if you got a 2700X 8 core 16 thread CPU in 2018, you don't need to upgrade anytime soon for specific games. Upgrading around your CPU to make sure that everything around your CPU is good, probably the better way to go.
But if you start to notice like all of your core usage across the board is looking pretty high here, this tends to be really more relevant to CPUs that have less core count, because there is a point where you will have way more core count than what a game could utilize. So if you have, say, I don't know, a 16 core CPU, and you're noticing, well, let's go back, say you have an 8 core CPU, and you're noticing that like all 8 cores are at like 80% usage, then that's a multi-threaded game that you're hitting the limits of what's available to the engine to be used with CPU. So that might be an indicator that it's time to upgrade your CPU.
Again, before we close out, I'm going to fast forward to the next section. Me personally, could care less about CPU utilization. If you see a huge performance difference in how your system's running when you actually play the game, that's what's most important. If you take another aspect, if you're trying to like run, like I know, like if you're playing a game, let's say you'd want to play a game and stream Discord in the background, or you want to be alt tabbing between your game and maybe a YouTube video or Spotify in the background. You're just doing multitasking, streaming possibly. Then yeah, I can see that argument for playing games. For the average person, an 8 core I still think is more than enough. And there's a lot of games out there that you can actually go in and change how many threads is actually going to utilize for the game. I've done that in the past for like Modern Warfare, for example. That's one of the games I've done it for. Done it for Warface, done it for PlanetSide 2. You can kind of just change around how the game actually utilizes your hardware if you do a deep dive on how to optimize your game. So that's just something worthwhile looking into. I think a lot of people need to actually look at optimizing their games rather than just trying to say plug it, start the game and run it. I think once you get past beyond that, there's actually a lot of performance left on the table that people don't necessarily look into because they don't necessarily want to optimize their games. But again, I digress, as he would say.
But let's say your CPU is showing mid to high usage and your GPU is also showing high usage, like 90s plus % on GPU util, then you're not bottlenecking yet. When it really becomes obvious that your GPU is becoming bottlenecked by your CPU is when the CPU usage is higher than the GPU usage. So typically on AMD and NVIDIA graphics cards, Intel as well, any graphics card, you want to be seeing like 95% plus usage. So you don't necessarily have to upgrade yet if that's the case. What you could be doing is run your game at a higher resolution, if that higher resolution is available to you, or up the quality settings of your game to put more load on the GPU. What that essentially does is make your game prettier. It's also going to lower your FPS some, which is going to lower some of the usage on the CPU. So not only is the CPU being hammered.
So here's one nuance that I think a lot of people will kind of skate by on this. Whenever you're having a CPU bottleneck, sometimes it can be exacerbated by whatever the hardware, the scheduler, that's probably the wrong term, but essentially the GPU will go into like a low power state mode because it isn't necessarily it's waiting on the CPU. You have a CPU bottleneck. If the CPU bottleneck is extreme enough and it's in like the right title, there will be certain situations where the GPU will actually downclock. One game I saw this in specifically was in Payday 2. This is probably one of the biggest offenders of the game of it happening. And this would even happen like when I was using my 5800X 3D. Because Payday 2 was such an old game and it was so easy for like whatever graphics card I was running at the time to run it, I would notice like the game feel like a little bit stuttery here and there. And the reason for that is because the GPU would actually downclock to like 200 something megahertz. And this was exacerbated when I was playing games like on my Threadripper CPU, my 2990, which is not optimized for playing games. I saw this on my FX based system. It would just downclock because the game was just so easy to run. It's like, barely running anything. This game's from like 2012. Graphics are really simple. I'm just going to downclock the GPU to save power. And that's actually where the FPS is lost. So I've seen that happen in CPU bottlenecks. A way around this, there's a lot of ways around this. You can either just undervolt your CPU or your GPU, because a lot of the graphics cards nowadays are on like a voltage frequency curve. lower power, lower voltage, obviously lower clock speed. If you undervolt your GPU, you can keep the clock speed higher at a lower voltage, and then that will kind of mitigate the situation. Another really good thing to use is actually NVIDIA Reflex. Its Reflex technology has for lowering latency. You can actually turn it on plus boost, and this will actually actively keep the clock speed higher on your NVIDIA graphics cards. Not sure if AMD has an equivalent. Haven't really messed around with modern AMD graphics cards really at all recently. But I do know on the NVIDIA side there are ways to keep your clock speeds high regardless of how little utilization your GPU is actually using. And there are certain games that are just like really big offenders of this, specifically in like the more CPU intensive games. PlanetSide 2, Payday 2, for example. If the GPU is waiting around too long, it will actually downclock, and that's where I saw like the FPS discrepancy. And also, like he was saying, if you turn the resolution up higher, you turn up the quality higher, you're now demanding more of the GPU, which will actually boost those clock speeds to be higher, and that's where you actually get the FPS gain. So there are other ways around this to actually be able to alleviate the actual CPU bottleneck. So I say that we're saying CPU bottlenecks can be like exacerbated because the actual clock speed of the GPU is decreasing because of like the discrepancy in the potential of the graphics card versus where it's actually at because it's waiting around on the CPU.
If your CPU usage is higher than your GPU usage, you are CPU bound. You are not getting the full performance of your GPU. It's waiting on your CPU. So either up the settings, the fidelity settings on your game to put more load on your GPU, or up your resolution to put more load on your GPU. That might mean, honestly, just buying a new monitor. It might mean not buying a $500 CPU or a $600 GPU. It might mean buying a $350 1440p panel instead of a 1080p panel. And then you'll notice it feels like you got an upgrade because you've got higher resolution, higher fidelity, your GPU is doing more of its job, the CPU is not doing as much because it's a higher resolution, which becomes GPU bound. This is why we have these discussions, so you can start to think about where your money needs to go.
That's a really good point on the monitors. If you haven't experienced a 1440p monitor or 4K monitor, a monitor with higher refresh rate than 60, like 120 hertz, a monitor with G-Sync or FreeSync technology, that could be one of the best investments you can do into a system. The level of detail that you get in your game, it will trounce any sort of graphics card upgrade in my personal opinion. You could go from a 2080 Ti to a 5090 on a 1080p monitor. More FPS, but gaming experience will be around the same. You do that monitor upgrade, you're really cooking there. So that's really a really good point. And in certain situations, he is right. You can get more performance that way just by doing a monitor upgrade. If you go from like LCD or like VA panel to OLED panel, I personally haven't done that, but I hear that's a huge upgrade too. So something to think about.
Let's talk about motherboards. Motherboards are voodoo. And I say they're voodoo because they really don't do anything other than connect everything together. You got your PCH, right? That's like your chipset. You've got your CPU socket, you've got your memory, you've got your graphics, you've got your PCI Express lanes, your storage, your SATA, fans, and all that. All that does is give everything a spot to connect. In fact, the term motherboard goes all the way back to when you had a main board and a daughter board and subsystems that had to connect to the motherboard for everything to work together. That's just, we've always continued the name motherboard even though daughter boards aren't so much a thing anymore, although starting to come back with some ITX motherboards where they have daughter boards on them to give you more functionality in a skyscraper vertical format. Anyway.
So, I think we kind of have like different opinions on this. I personally think maturing as a PC builder and like enthusiast means that you actually prioritize the motherboard than you do the CPU. CPUs, like I said before, they're the conductor. I really think like the motherboard is like they're the string section of a symphony, like the violins, the cello, the bass. Like they're really what like make you cry when you hear the music. The reason for that is because you never know what you're going to want on a motherboard or what's important to you on a motherboard until you actually look to do something with it and you don't have it on the motherboard you bought. And then at that point, you're pretty much doing like, in my personal opinion, if you have to swap a motherboard, you're doing a full system rebuild, in my personal opinion. There are so many just nuanced things that will happen when upgrading a motherboard that it just boggles my mind. There's been times where you swap a motherboard, and even though Windows is supposed to be cross-compatible, I'm not no longer able to boot into the recovery or the recovery doesn't appear on my hard drive. So I have to reinstall Windows. And this was before I did like my partitioning of hard drives, which I'll get into it a little bit later in this video. I think you'd be better off knowing the importance of like different motherboard features when you buy it versus when you don't, for the possibility of like that one feature that you might want that you don't have is going to be an issue. So one good example I think is like Wi-Fi connectivity. Now, for a desktop, if you have the ability to use, a Ethernet connection, that's probably the way you should go. But cheaping out on a non-Wi-Fi motherboard, in my personal opinion, could be one of the worst decisions you could make when building a system. Unless you know for a fact you're always going to use Ethernet on your system, get a motherboard with Wi-Fi built in. It's always, always, always worthwhile getting that in your system. You never know, like, you might move to a new location and you no longer have a Ethernet hookup in the room you want to, set up your system in. Yeah, it's something as simple as that. You might not always be using your system right next to the router or right next to an outlet to run Ethernet to. If you don't have Wi-Fi capabilities built in your motherboard, now you're buying a separate card that's going to need now put into one of your PCIe slots, which isn't a big deal. You might not have enough USBs on a cheap motherboard. I've used cheap motherboards in the past, like budget. Like I used to like go for like top end chipset, but like bare bones top end chipset motherboards, and I would only have maybe like 6 to 7, maybe 8 USBs on the back, and I would populate that really quickly. Mouse, keyboard, microphone, webcam, sound card. That's 5 right there, and then I might only have like 2 or 3 more USBs left over. And what if they're not the right speed that I need? Oh, I would have 6 to 1 for my external drive. So that's 6 connectivity things right there. You might have like a USB capture card you want to plug into. Now you've maxed out all your USBs on the back of your system, and you might not be able to expand for what you need. But looking beyond that, I think one of the best things that people will sometimes look over is actually the PCIe slot allocation. Different motherboards are going to have different ways to actually allocate the PCIe slots. It will depend like on the platform to an extent, but some motherboards will have PCIe bifurcation built into them, and others won't. You might end up losing lanes completely just by, plugging in an accessory that you didn't need to buy or use if you had more diligently looked into what your motherboard comes with out of the factory. You buy a budget CPU without motherboard without enough USBs, without Wi-Fi built in. Those are 2 add-in cards you need to add. Now you're robbing lanes from your graphics card, or maybe one of your M.2 slots is being deactivated, so on and so forth. Maybe you're trying to max out like storage, but you don't have PCIe bifurcation, so now you have to like buy all these other different combos or like expansions, secondary boards and accessories for PCIe to get your needs met. Now you're choking off the exhaust or the intake of fans on your graphics card because you have this PCB covering half of it up, so your graphics card temps go up. It's really not worth it. Also, like PCIe slot spacing, something else people don't necessarily consider. You're looking to do water-cooled builds. Does your motherboard have like enough temp sensors to be able to monitor your water temperatures, which is actually really helpful? Does your motherboard have enough fan connectors? How is your actual fan controllers actually set up to control fans? This is not really a big of an issue on like modern motherboards. A lot of modern motherboard fan controls are good, but I know like on older motherboards, like on my FX system, for example, all of the chassis fans are all controlled off the same frequency. So all of the chassis fans that aren't based on the CPU, I have to set the exact same PWM curve or specs for every single one of those drivers for those fans, versus like all of them being set up separately. A good modern motherboard will allow you to have multiple fan headers. One can be controlled to be based on a 3-pin fan or a PWM signal versus DC signal. You can set them all individually. That will help you optimize your airflow. You might want to have a static 1,000 RPM on your exhaust versus like dynamic fan curves on your intake, and for whatever it might be. You never know what you are going to want on a motherboard until you don't have it, and when you don't have it, now you need to do a whole upgrade. And doing a motherboard upgrade, like, again, opens a whole window of issues to happen. Now you're running like a motherboard that has different drivers set up on it, and that's going to unoptimize your system. You need to upgrade your motherboard. You might as well do like a fresh install of Windows. It's better just to avoid all of this. If you're going to invest more money in a system, like I think obviously graphics card should take priority for your dollar amount. Then it should be motherboard. Look into spending more money on your motherboard than your CPU. You can always upgrade your CPU later. Upgrading your motherboard might be one of the more difficult things to do. And then I didn't even get into like power delivery. If you're buying like a budget CPU and then you want to like upgrade to a new CPU for that system a couple of years later, then overclock that to get more performance. You buy that budget motherboard, might not be able to handle it and give you the performance you need. So just things to look into. I could even go in more detail on like specific motherboards having BIOS settings that are going to allow you to overclock and max your system out. Some motherboards just won't allow you to change certain settings. Won't have the VRM cooling or whatever. So
motherboards is an easy place to overspend and sometimes feel like you need to upgrade. The only time you really need to consider a motherboard upgrade is if you're starting to have feature sets on your motherboard that are older than the feature sets of the parts you're putting on there. What do I mean by that? Back when PCI Gen 3 was a thing, PCI Gen 4 graphics cards came out. And there's a huge discussion about PCIe Gen lane speeds versus modern hardware. And you leave a little bit of performance on the table if you run, say, a Gen 4 drive on or Gen 4 graphics card on a Gen 3 PCI Express socket. Maybe a whole video needs to be done about this, but you'll notice low single-digit performance differences because what you typically would find is that you'll be running like 8x versus 16x depending on the socket and the way that it's inverted, if you will. But that should not be the main reason you would upgrade a motherboard. Usually the reason why a person upgrades a motherboard is the socket is no longer compatible with the CPU you want to run. That's usually the thing. I would recommend upgrading your motherboard if you are, say, starting to lack the amount of connectivity you need, like say M.2 drive storage, or you only have like one Gen 4 to the CPU and all the rest are Gen 3 and you're sitting here on 3 Gen 4 drives. Why would you have Gen 4 drives if you're only getting Gen 3 speed? So
I'm sure he'll make a separate section on hard drive specifically, and then I'll share my thoughts on that. But just to touch on this, the whole PCIe frequency or like the generation as far as how much bandwidth you get per system, I'm just going to speak from like, he is right, you will leave performance on the table. I'm going to speak from like personal experience. I use a Gen 4 GPU on a Gen 2 PCIe. Am I usually losing performance on the table? Yes. Does it still do what I need to do? Yes. A lot of the video footage you see on my channel as far as like gameplay is on that system. FX based system with Gen 2 on with a 3080. Take it with what you will. I don't think it's really that big of an issue. Also with the drive speed issue, yes, you are going to cap your max like read and write speed situation for your drive, but you have to ask your question, how often is your drive going to be asked to transfer that level of data at that speed? Very little to none. For gamers, at most it's going to be when installing a game, right? And even when you're installing the game, what are you going to be limited by? Your download speed. Your drive is only able to compile as much storage as it has access to. So once your game's like actually fully downloaded, then you have to like install it. And at that point, you might be able to see like a difference in maybe like, let's take an extreme example, like 30 seconds to a minute. Is that worth upgrading a whole motherboard for? Whole platform for? Not really. When loading games, certain situations, Gen 3 versus Gen 4, negligent in performance, where you're really going to start noticing a difference with drives actually based on like their controllers. The actual like was a QLC drive, TLC drive, MLC drive, that's going to make a more of a difference as far as the quality of life, as far as how responsive and performant your drive actually is. The controller that's put on your drive will actually make a way bigger difference for gamers versus actual max read and write speeds. And even on some drives, like you'll be able to hit those speeds for like maybe 30 seconds, and then it'll drop back down to like normal speeds. But again, just doing normal day-to-day tasks, playing a video game, you're never going to be hitting over like 2,000 megabytes per second, or megabits per second, whatever it is for that. And that's like right around where it sits for Gen 2. Max read speeds and write speeds are like right around 2,000 for Gen 2, at least on my system. And that's still more than enough to do pretty much everything. Games will install slower, but you're limited by your connectivity anyways.
Now we're going to talk about drive upgrades, because what a lot of people tend to not realize, you start populating all of these M.2 slots on your board, those are taking up PCIe lanes, which means you might be dropping your graphics card down from like Gen 4 16X down to like a Gen 4 8X, because it has to have bandwidth available for those drives. Now, you usually have at least one drive that's direct to CPU, which means it's not taking up PCI Express lanes. But everything else has to go through the PCH, which means now you start adding tons and tons and tons of drives because you need more storage. You've outgrown your 1 terabyte drive. You throw another 1 terabyte, then another 1 terabyte, then another 1 terabyte. Not knowing every time you plug a drive in, you might be taking away some of that bandwidth available to your GPU. Or you might have drives that just straight up don't show up because there's lane limitations because you're on maybe an older platform that only had, say, I think 32 lanes, or maybe even less. I don't remember the lane counts. It's just all over the place these days.
So I will say, if you look and spec out your motherboard correctly when building a system, a lot of these issues that he's explaining right now with drives can be avoided. You look at how many lanes does my CPU actually have access to? What is the actual chipset capable as far as like providing additional lanes? What is the actual like layout? If I populate this drive in this specific motherboard, what will it change for my graphics card? Where should I put my additional SSD? Does it have enough connection? Because even on the same chipset, not all motherboards go about the same way of splitting up, the PCIe, express lanes between different accessories. So this is, he's kind of making the point for me where motherboards should be taken more than just, look at it doing if you're doing a full CPU upgrade.
So my recommendation regarding drives at this point is sometimes it makes more sense to just buy a larger drive than what you have, clone it from your current OS and games and all that stuff, and still only utilize whatever lanes you're currently utilizing with your drive, but now you have double or quadruple the storage. So going from, say, a 1 terabyte NVMe drive on Gen 3, you've upgraded your system now, and then you maybe go buy yourself a 2 terabyte or even a 4 terabyte NVMe like Gen 4 drive. You're gonna get faster drive speed and you get quadruple the storage, and you didn't take up any more lanes in your system. That's the kind of stuff I think people don't really think about.
Okay, so I'm gonna make my point that I was gonna make earlier about the drives. A lot of people think like if I have a Gen 3 express lane on my motherboard, I need a Gen 3 drive. That really does not make sense. In most situations, if you have Gen 2, Gen 3, you should be buying Gen 4 SSDs because those are the ones that are actually going to have the price benefit. Think of it now, we're in 2024, right? No one's making Gen 3 SSDs anymore. So you're left with, if you're looking to do a storage upgrade, I either buy like old new stock of a Gen 3 drive that's probably skyrocketed in price versus what it's actually worth, or it matches price parity with the Gen 4 drives, or you just buy a Gen 4 drive that's on sale, and that will get you more performance, because it's going to give you more performance. The bottleneck is going to be your actual motherboard, not your drive itself. With the proper Gen 4 drive on a Gen 3 system, with a good controller, good memory layout as far as the NAND flash they're using on there, you're pretty much always going to be maxing out the max read and write speeds of your motherboard without any sort of fuss. This is what I have a 970 Evo Plus in my FX system. I'm pretty much, if I run like back-to-back drive tests over and over and over again, the 970 Evo is like what most people see is the best Gen 3 SSD. I'm maxing out the potential bandwidth of that motherboard all the time. You put a Gen 2 SSD, with not as good a controller, not as good a memory setup scheme, on an older system, you might actually lose maximum, what you actually the max read and write speeds that you actually see when you actually test it on a regular basis. So again, from a pricing standpoint, it makes more sense to buy what is actually available right now for the right price. When you eventually do an upgrade, you're going to see that gain in performance right there. Gen 5 drives, not so much because they're still inflated in price by quite a bit and require a decent amount of cooling, so different there. But if you're using like a Gen 3 system, buy Gen 4 drives, put that on there. His point he was making about big single SSDs, I personally don't agree with that take. And this, like for this PCI lane allocation, this is why I still think SATA-based storage is still very important. I think personally, if you're going to build a system, you have a 3-drive method. I have my boot drive, my game drive, and my scratch drive. If it's a workstation, your boot drive, your big program slash video editing drive, whatever it is right there, where you restore your projects, and then like your scratch drive, your archive drive, where you archive your projects once you're done with them. The reason I think of this is because you're actually going to be dividing up the workloads individually. If you need 4 terabytes of storage, right, and I can just get one giant 4 terabyte drive to run everything. Well, let's take like a streamer for example. Now you're going to be running Windows and all the background tasks on this one drive. You're going to be running your game on that drive as well, plus all your streaming software, all on that same drive. So that drive is going to be seeing a lot of reads and a lot of writes. It can handle it. There's hard drives out there that can't handle that, no problem. But it makes more sense to be able to split that across a different drive. You have one drive just dedicated to only running the OS, right? It'll run Windows. Maybe you have like your browsers or other basic programs running in the background, Discord, Spotify, normal Windows programs that you would have on an everyday computer. Then you have your game running on a separate drive, and then you have your recording to and storing your video footage on a separate drive right there. So instead of like running Windows, running your game, and writing to that drive all at the same time, now you're running Windows on one drive, running your game on a separate drive, and then writing to a separate drive. And when you do it that way, you can actually max out capacity without necessarily needing the fastest, most performant SSD, because running all those three things at the same time is going to require a pretty beefy, high capacity SSD like a 990 Pro 4 terabyte. You're spending a crap ton of money for 4 terabytes. Or I could get maybe a 1 terabyte 990 Pro for significantly less money. Maybe a 2 terabyte Gen 3 SD, or maybe a SATA SSD Gen 3 for like 2 terabytes right there. So now you have 3 terabytes. And then you get like a big, massive, like 4 terabyte hard disk drive, spinning hard disk drive that you just use to write your video footage to. Accessing video footage, writing the video footage, hard disk drives still work fantastically for that. And now you have maybe 6 to 8 terabytes versus 4 terabytes of normal usable storage, and you save money doing that process, and technically could be faster. You're not going to be stressing out your main SSD as much. And if you do just one giant hard disk drive, if you look to, reinstall Windows because you corrupt your OS, now you're losing all your storage for like your video footage. You're losing all your downloaded games. But if you do like a separate boot drive where all you have is just Windows, I can, frequently just like wipe my SSD with my Windows on it and reinstall it and have no problem whatsoever. Unplug my big storage where I have my scratch drive, unplug my game drive, reinstall Windows, reinstall Steam, plug those back in, recognize the library, boom, all my games are right there. Updated, ready to go. All my video footage, stored, ready to go. No worries whatsoever. Now when you do this, when you install Windows, make sure you only have one drive connected, because sometimes they'll mess around and put the recovery on one of your other drives, which I don't know why it does that, but I've had that happen in the past. But the 3-drive method is a way better option, and that will allow you to not necessarily have to focus on one giant, high-performing 990 Pro T700 equivalent SSD to handle your whole workload. So the 3-drive method saves money and gives you pretty much the same performance, and is more secure. If you need to reinstall Windows, you'll be able to maintain higher performance longer for less money.
Consider maybe getting a faster, or at least as fast as your board will support, higher capacity drive, taking your other drive, getting yourself like a USB-C external like drive enclosure, and then keeping that available to you through USB-C, because
you'd be surprised how well games run on SATA SSDs and SATA hard drives when there isn't Windows running in the background. Just saying. The load times can be nearly identical to high performance M.2 SSDs when it's just the game running on that drive and nothing else. Just something to think about.
You're still going to get very fast connectivity through USB-C. Obviously not native speeds of like NVMe with PCIe, but still fast enough to where you could use that to start putting bulk storage on that's maybe taking up space. Or even games you don't play all that often, but you could still have that drive hooked up to your Steam drive and utilize that drive to do something besides at that point just being waste once you've cloned or updated your drive to a second drive. So consider that. Let's talk about cooling. Cooling is one of those areas where people definitely like to overbuild. I'm one of them. Cooling, there's no such thing as too much cooling. There's definitely a thing as not enough. Modern CPUs are power hungry. Modern CPUs can run hot. In fact, Intel just upped the TJ Maxx on Arrow Lake from 14th gen from 100C to 105C. So now we have 5 extra C available to us in terms of headroom before throttling and stuff can happen. Although that is considered spec, I don't know any PC enthusiast that would tolerate 105C. So you start to beef up your cooling.
Bro, 105C, I don't even tolerate 80 degrees C. And that's partially because with the FX-based platform that I've spent most of my time using, the CPU will noticeably decrease in performance if you get anything above 60 degrees Celsius on the cores, um, which is it's crazy. Well, it's 70 degrees on the core, 60 on the socket. Is that right? No, 60 degrees on the cores, 70 degrees on the socket. Anything above that, you start seeing lower performance. So, in my opinion, that's hot. But obviously, with modern CPUs nowadays, like that's not the case. But that sort of mindset, like ingrained in me, that all my CPUs need to be running below 75 degrees Celsius, or else they're not gonna be. I have like at least another 15 degrees, and I'll still be fine. But again, it's a good mindset to have, I suppose. But I have a feeling we're probably going to agree on this. I will say there are a lot of good air coolers nowadays available that we didn't have available in the past. Fan technology is way better than it was in the past, so you don't necessarily need to have custom water cooling or a liquid cooler. And then also, tuning your CPU, undervolting, whatever you might have you, is always going to be beneficial for cooling.
Your temps are higher than you want them to be. Let's say 90C, 95C. That starts to become a little bit worrisome. You know your voltage is in line. It should be where it is. Then it might be time to upgrade your cooling if it's more of a peace of mind thing. That's of course meaning you ruled out that anything is starting to fail on your system. Your pump hasn't started to slow down because it is still just an electric coil that can and does and will fail over time. So when it comes to upgrading your cooling, unless you're going to be also wanting to overclock and maybe push the limits of your CPU, then cooling is more often than not something that is necessary for an upgrade. Unless whatever you upgrade to, like platform-wise, isn't supported by whatever bracketry that's on your cooler. I think power supply is probably the main component that stays in your system the longest, outside of maybe your case. Very rarely do you need to upgrade a power supply. Power supplies either work or they don't. It is black and white on that one. So unless you've upgraded your platform to something that is now approaching the operational limits of your power supply, let's say you've got a 650 watt power supply, well, a 650 watt power supply that was perfectly fine for say a 9900K, and you had a 1080 Ti, which is only a 250 watt card. You know, you've got your system fans and stuff in there. You've got plenty of headroom at 650 watt, and probably still staying in the efficiency curve to a point to where you're not blowing that curve out of the water. Remember, the curve is a bell. The more you are around that 50-60% curve, the most efficient the power supply is. But as you approach the limits of the power supply, that curve goes back down again to where now you're pulling more watts from the wall than you would be, and you start to see high power bills and stuff. But most people don't. Most people are going to argue with me on this probably, but I don't know many gamers that are concerned about the amount of money they're spending on their power bill. They are definitely concerned about the performance they're getting.
That's a fair point. This is why I think like building like that budget system really doesn't make that much sense. If you're going to get a power supply, I think 850 at the minimum is what you should be targeting. 850 gold modular, fully modular power supply is what I would say is your basement for a PC build if I was to do one nowadays, or build one for a person. Gives you more than enough headroom. You know, you can get to an extent high-end graphics cards to work on 850. I think like people have used 850s with 4090s. I wouldn't do it personally, but you can get it to work. But you don't necessarily need a 4090, for example. A lot of people aren't going to spend that kind of cash on a graphics card. 4080s, 4870 Ti's, 7800 XTs, 7900 XTs, you know, they're going to work for perfectly fine on an 850 power supply. This is assuming you only have like an air cooler, not a lot of custom water cooling. Build quality, in my opinion, is also way more important. Brands off the top of my head that I personally use and have experience with, my go-to is either C.A.S.T or Enermax. I use Enermax Max Revo on my main system. I have a C.A.S.T Gold GFX in my workstation. I have a Corsair in my FX-based system because my old LEPA power supply, which was a subsidiary brand of Enermax, but a little bit on the cheaper side, it started, I changed the fan on it, and it actually started like smelling kind of bad, and it was a pretty old graphics power supply. But Corsair, you know, they make good power supplies as well, although price performance wise, I think I would rather use like a C.A.S.T versus a Corsair, but they make good power supplies. So those are probably the three off the top of my head that I would recommend. As far as hierarchy goes, I think C.A.S.T is probably a step above Corsair, which might be a slight step above Enermax, but it depends on which brand of Enermax or Corsair power supply you're actually looking at, or like SKU, I should say. But yeah, I would say 850 at the minimum. You should be able to get an 850 fully modular, gold rated power supply for $100 nowadays. So there's really no excuse not to get that. because the difference between a $60 power supply and that $100 power supply will be a world of a difference as far as like upgradability. From my standpoint, if I can't get custom cables made for my power supply, I'm not going to get it anyways because I'm going to get custom cables. So usually that's relegated to the higher end power supplies. So you can think of it that way as well. If you can't get custom cables for the power supply, might not be the best quality.
The last thing we're going to talk about here is going to be case. This is a no-brainer. Unless your case is somehow just choking your system to death. Like, it is just full-on physical assaulting your components because of the amount of like closed-off mesh or whatever on there. Unless your case is no longer able to hold the components you want to put in there, so you got an EATX motherboard and you only have an ATX case, then you're forced into an upgrade. You don't need me to tell you that. If you're just looking at your case and you're going, I'm sick of your face, then it's time to upgrade it, I guess, or change it. But cases and power supplies tend to be the components people hang on to the longest.
This is also a good point. I would say, honestly, when I build a PC nowadays, one of the first parts I look at is the case, because that's what you're going to be interacting with, what you're going to see on your desk. Build your PC around the case. Most people are going to have a good idea of what platform they're going to go with, depending on their workstation or their workload. So the case is what I mostly look for. I think, personally, and I can make a whole separate videos, I probably will, the fish tank cases that are like popular nowadays, the dual chambers is a more accurate term, but the fish tank is what I call them. I think that's kind of like, they work, but it's like kind of just a step above when we had those full glass boxes that were like taking over the market in 2017 to 2018 with no airflow. These have airflow, but like you're complicating the way airflow works in these cases for the sake of aesthetics, which is why I like the View 27, the View 28. They're just simple, front to back, airflow. It just works. Proven, simply works, and it looks like a computer versus like a fish tank. So, but different strokes for different folks. Pick a case that you think is like looks nice. Look at reviews. Gamers Next is a fantastic review on cases, and like all the airflow numbers you could want to your heart's content. Build notes, all that kind of good stuff. Material quality, all that kind of good stuff. Very good information to use on modern cases. But I'm more old school. I like the cases that I grew up seeing, and like once you get a good case, like you're not going to upgrade it, which is like my case with the ones I personally have.
Anyway, wanted to have some of this talking head stuff because of the fact that not only are we moving and it's kind of easier to talk than to show stuff as things are literally moving out of here as we speak, but these are questions I'm still getting. And because we talked about the fact that a lot of the world has synced up into a 5-year cycle, and now we're looking at 2025 probably being a pretty big year for people to start upgrading their systems. These are the questions I'm starting to see filter in both on our Discord at discord.gg/Jace2cents and through email and Twitter and all that sort of stuff. So I take these comments and then I turn them into content like this.
So overall, that's pretty much the video. We agreed on some points, disagreed on other points, but I really did enjoy, looking and giving my reaction on this. My closing argument is this: like with normal PC builds, that I think the way that he was describing it, they last 5 years. I could be biased, but I think with my mindset, with how you pick your components and everything, you're probably looking closer to like a 6, 7, maybe 8-year window before you necessarily need to upgrade. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys learned something new. And hopefully this will give you some tips that you need and can use on your next PC build. So this is C.A.S.T, guys. Hope you enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next one.